This is Kim Hallen of Unbridled LLC in Charleston, South Carolina, and welcome to episode 2 of Awakening the Soul of Relicario. Whenever I'm interacting with a horse in a way that involves me touching the horse, I always try to keep one overarching question in my mind, and actually to hold this question in my heart. How does my touch make you feel? In this episode, I'm going to share some brief video clips that show how I used this question in an effort to learn more about Rayleigh after his arrival and as the basis for beginning to develop greater trust in our relationship going forward. It's important to note that Rayleigh came to me with some very deep and well-established avoidance patterns, especially when it comes to letting someone touch him anywhere on his body that's further back than his head. Rayleigh is a very social horse, and he wants to interact with people, but only if you stay in front of him. For the most part, Rayleigh is quite happy to receive touch on his face, as long as that touch is offered politely, and especially if it's initiated by him and he feels in control of it. By far, his favorite way to interact with people is over a fence. Rayleigh has learned that the fence provides a safety net that allows him to maintain control over how much access someone has to the rest of his body. One of the first indicators I noticed that gave me a clue just how much anxiety and vulnerability Rayleigh feels when interacting with people was his obsession with nibbling, which you see him doing here on my face. While nibbling can be a friendly or curious behavior in some instances, when it's done obsessively or every time a horse is in close proximity to humans, it's usually an indication of a fairly high level of anxiety. I also discovered very quickly that when Rayleigh is at liberty without a fence between us, he has a whole array of rather elaborate and often dangerous defense mechanisms. Primarily, Rayleigh will use his head, neck, and shoulder to ram into you and sometimes push you right off your feet. And this can happen pretty quickly and rather unexpectedly, as you can see from this photo. Rayleigh will also do this when you are leading him with a halter and lead line, but if he's tied, his behavior is much different, and in that situation, he's much more likely to want to bolt or try to escape. Because my goal, especially early on, was for my touch to be gentle as often as possible, I really wanted to go out of my way to avoid scenarios like this one, where I felt I had to use my hands in a defensive way to keep myself safe when I was interacting with Rayleigh. This is why in the video clips you're about to see, I opted to have Rayleigh tied while I was having conversations with him about how my touch felt to him. As we launch into the video footage, I want to stress that this is not a training video. I am not trying to modify Rayleigh's behavior in any way. I am simply trying to understand how he feels about what I'm doing and how he communicates about what he feels. Meanwhile, I also know that he's trying to understand how I feel about what he's doing and how I communicate about my feelings. This is what mutuality is all about. And we're having a series of conversations that are simply about getting to know one another and trying to understand each other's hopes and fears and preferences. And we're learning together about how we both need to communicate in order to feel safe together and to build greater levels of trust, respect, and partnership. Because Rayleigh is tied here, I wanted to be really sure that I had his permission to be in his personal space before we started having conversations about me touching him and how that made him feel. The less liberty a horse has, the more empathy we need to have, and it's obvious here that Rayleigh is simply tolerating my touch. He's not giving any indication that he is enjoying this touch or particularly likes it. I think he has just been trained or taught in the past to stand still for touch when he's tied. So in the first video clip, I had been asking Rayleigh how he felt about my touch on his neck, and he was pretty ambivalent to that. Here, I decided to go a little further back to his wither and top of his back, and something really interesting happened. You see him looking around. I wasn't initially sure whether that was a positive response or a negative response. The fact that his head is turned away, his ears are back a little, I was thinking that it was probably not a positive response, but I decided to ask him again. And I changed the way that I was rubbing into more of a stroke. And you see how he lowered his head. And that was the first indication he had given me that maybe my touch felt good to him. In this third segment, I decided to line up next to Rayleigh's shoulder and face my body in the same direction that his was facing, and just try to be in synchrony with him to let him know that I was there in friendship and I wanted to bond with him, and I really didn't want to put pressure on him. There I'm noticing that he has some flies, and so I wanted to see if he would respond positively if I did something useful for him, which was to try to swat the flies or swish the flies, but it didn't really seem to make much difference to him. So I went back to the area of his back where I had gotten the positive response before, and I just wanted to see if he would respond positively again. I was doing a couple different types of touch, and in a minute here you're going to see him turn his head and look again like he had done in the previous clip. And this time, because that was a repeated pattern, I knew that that was potentially a positive sign and that he was responding and trying to communicate with me about how that particular touch on his back feels. Now I want to jump to a couple months later, but I want to stress that I didn't do this kind of work with Rayleigh on a daily basis, or often not even on a weekly basis. I don't consider this kind of work training. It's simply relationship building, and we were continuing to get to know each other. What I want you to notice about this clip is just how much more relaxed Rayleigh is. He's moving around more. He's not, standing stock still. I can't really say that Rayleigh is showing any signs that he is loving this touch or that he's asking for it, but he certainly is more relaxed. He's more comfortable with me being around him, and he doesn't have, again, that sort of frozen in place look. His expression is a lot less concerned, and he's pretty relaxed even as I'm moving around him and touching him in different places. Taking a break, then he actually cocks his back leg. He's looking around at things, just definitely less disturbed or concerned about my touch than he was in the earlier clips. The final two short video clips I'm going to show you were taken another 6 months later after that, and Rayleigh and I had continued to spend a lot of time, working on this touch relationship, and these two clips were taken actually right after a hoof trimming session, which I'll be doing another episode on his issues with hoof trimming. But what's wonderful is my trimmer caught on video the first time that Rayleigh actually really started showing me that he loved a way that I was touching him. And what's really cool about this is that I was actually rubbing him really, really hard to an extent that he would never have tolerated it in the beginning. But it turns out that this is what he really enjoys, is a very firm, deep rub on his neck. Thanks for tuning in today. I hope you enjoyed this episode and that it gives you some ideas about how you can use your horse's responses to your touch for relationship building and nurturing trust.